Welcome to St. Mary's Hospital, where every day is a mix of life, death, and let's be honest, a whole lot of drama. Behind the sterile walls and the constant beeping of monitors lies a world of unspoken rivalries, unexpected alliances, and life lessons waiting to unfold. Today, I'm bringing you a story about two nurses who couldn't be more different. Amara Johnson, loved by patients and admired by her peers, and Jessica Marshall, whose envy and insecurities led to a showdown that no one saw coming. This isn't just a story about hospital politics. It's about resilience, discrimination, redemption, and what happens when biases go unchecked. Let's dive in. Amara Johnson had a way of making the busiest days at St. Mary's feel manageable. Her calm demeanor, coupled with her sharp instinct, earned her the respect of almost everyone she worked with. Almost. Jessica Marshall, another nurse on the ward, watched Amara with a mix of disdain and frustration. Jessica wasn't a bad nurse, far from it, but she often felt overshadowed by Amara's natural charisma and seemingly perfect track record. To make matters worse, Jessica harbored an unspoken bias that colored her perception of Amara's abilities. The first confrontation came on a hectic Monday morning. Amara was flushing Mr. Howard's IV line with saline, ensuring everything was spotless and secure for a CT scan. Mr. Howard, a retired chief medical officer, observed her work with quiet approval. As Amara wrapped up, Jessica walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Amara," Jessica said, her voice sharp. "Did you forget to clean the IV site? Again?" Amara turned to face her, keeping her voice steady. "I checked and flushed it this morning. It's clean and ready for a scan. And Mr. Howard's vitals are stable." Jessica scoffed, loud enough for others to hear. "Well, maybe someone else should double check your work, just to be safe, and so we don't get any complaint." The room went silent. Mr. Howard was surprised, but said nothing. Amara refused to let Jessica's comment rattle her. She simply nodded and moved on. But the tension lingered long after she left the room. As the days turned into weeks, Jessica's resentment toward Amara only grew. Amara's ability to remain composed, even under pressure, seemed to irritate Jessica more than anything else. It was as if Amara's very existence was a reminder of everything Jessica felt she lacked. One afternoon, Amara was in Mrs. Patel's room, carefully explaining the discharge instructions. Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman with a sharp wit and a love for knitting, had grown fond of Amara. She listened intently as Amara described the exercises she needed to do at home. "Now, Mrs. Patel," Amara said gently, "these exercises might feel a bit uncomfortable at first, but they'll help strengthen your knee. If you have any concerns, you know what to do. Do not hesitate to call us at all." Before Mrs. Patel could respond, Jessica stormed into the room. "Mrs. Patel," she began, her tone dripping with fake concern, "are you sure you're comfortable with those instructions? Sometimes nurses overlook things. It's always good to double check." Mrs. Patel looked up, clearly puzzled. "Double check? But Nurse Amara has been wonderful. I trust her completely." Jessica ignored the compliment, pressing on. "Well, Mrs. Patel, if you notice anything unusual, just let me know, and I'll make sure it's handled." Amara, who had been standing silently, finally spoke. "Mrs. Patel, if you have any questions about your care, I'm happy to answer them." Mrs. Patel, however, had had enough. Turning to Jessica, she said, "Young lady, if anyone needs double checking, it's you. Now kindly leave us to finish what we were doing. Thank you." Jessica's face turned bright red as she left the room, muttering under her breath. Amara gave Mrs. Patel a small smile before continuing their conversation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. As tension between Amara and Jessica escalated, an anonymous letter appeared on Angela Clark's desk. Angela, the ward manager, was known for her fair but firm leadership. The letter accused Amara of negligence, citing specific incidents that didn't align with her spotless record. Angela called Amara into her office. "Amara," she began. Her tone was serious. "I've received some concerning reports. They claim you've been neglecting your duties. Do you know anything about this?" Amara frowned, her mind racing. "No, Angela. I take my responsibilities very seriously. I can't imagine where this is coming from." Angela studied her for a moment. "I believe you, but I need to investigate. Until then, stay focused and let me know if anything unusual happens." Amara left the office with a heavy heart. She couldn't prove it, but she had a strong suspicion about who might be behind the letter. The problem was, without evidence, there was little she could do. Meanwhile, Jessica watched from a distance, a smug smile playing on her lips. She thought a plan was working. What she didn't realize was that her actions were starting to catch up with her. While Amara was trying to keep her head down, Mr. Howard was keeping a close eye on the situation. He had spent decades navigating the complexity of hospital politics and could see right through Jessica's facade. Deciding to intervene, Mr. Howard requested a private meeting with Angela. "Angela," he began, "I have seen a lot during my time here, but what's happening with Nurse Johnson isn't right." Angela leaned back in her chair. "What do you mean?" "Jessica's behavior is toxic," Mr. Howard continued. "She is undermining a colleague who has done nothing but provide excellent care. This isn't just about Amara, it's about the culture in this ward. If you let this go unchecked, it will affect everyone." Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. "So what do you suggest, Mr. Howard?" "Talk to the patient," Mr. Howard said. "They'll tell you who they trust. And as for Jessica, sometimes people like her need to learn the hard way." Angela took Mr. Howard's advice and began speaking to patients privately. What she discovered painted a clear picture. Patients like Mrs. Patel and Mr. Howard described Amara as compassionate, skilled, and professional. Jessica, on the other hand, was often mentioned as abrupt and unkind. The most damning evidence came from Mrs. Patel. She approached Angela one afternoon, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Angela, I overheard something troubling," she said. "Jessica was talking to another nurse about Amara, and she said people like her don't belong here." Angela's face hardened. This wasn't just a professional issue, it was personal. Armed with this information, Angela prepared for what she knew would be a difficult confrontation. If you are enjoying this story, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's continue. The breaking point came during a particularly chaotic shift. The ward was overwhelmed and everyone was scrambling to manage the influx of patients. Amid the chaos, Jessica once again crossed the line. In front of patients, staff, and even a junior doctor, she loudly questioned Amara's competence. "I don't understand why you would handle it like that," Jessica said. "Honestly, I don't even know if you qualified for this." Amara froze, her professionalism struggling to mask the sting of Jessica's words. The room fell silent. All eyes turned towards Angela Clark, the ward manager, who happened to be nearby. Angela stepped forward, her expression calm, but her voice very stern. "Jessica, my office, now." The confrontation in Angela's office was tense. Angela laid out everything. The patient testimonies, the anonymous letter traced back to Jessica's computer, and her repeated unprofessional behavior. "This behavior is unacceptable," Angela said firmly. "You've created a toxic environment, undermined a colleague, and jeopardized patient trust. While you haven't left me enough to dismiss you outright, I cannot allow this to continue." Jessica's face turned pale. I was just trying to look out for the patients. No, Angela replied, her tone sharp. You were trying to tear down a colleague for your own reasons. I'm placing you on suspension, effective immediately, pending further investigation. Jessica stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. The news of her suspension spread through the hospital like wildfire. For some, it was a wake-up call. There were whispers among staff who had engaged in similar behavior, some who subtly undermined their colleagues, using sarcasm or questioning their decisions. Seeing Jessica suspended made them realize their actions could have serious consequences. For others like Amara and a handful of nurses who had been on the receiving end of bullying and bias, the suspension felt like validation. It was proof that the hospital wouldn't tolerate toxic behavior. Jessica's suspension cast a shadow over the ward. Some staff avoided discussing it altogether, while others whispered their theories about what might happen next. But for Angela and the leadership team, the decision wasn't just about Jessica. It was about sending a message, and the message was clear. Respect and professionalism were non-negotiable. With Jessica suspended, the atmosphere in the hospital began to shift. Staff members who had previously felt emboldened by Jessica's behavior started to reevaluate their actions. Small moments of kindness replaced snide remarks, and the ward began to feel less like a battleground and more like a place of healing. For Amara, the suspension brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated. For months, she had endured Jessica's subtle digs and outright hostilities, all while maintaining her professionalism. But on the other hand, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of pity in some of her colleagues' gazes. It was as if they now saw her as a victim. That was a role Amara didn't want to play. One afternoon, Mrs. Patel came to visit. Now fully recovered, she walked into the ward with her cane and a bright smile. "Nurse Amara," she called out. "I had to come back and see you." Amara's face lit up. "Mrs. Patel, it's so good to see you." Mrs. Patel leaned in conspiratorially. "I heard about the other nurse, the one who was always trying to cause trouble for you. I hope they've learned their lesson." Amara hesitated. "I hope so too," she said softly. Meanwhile, Jessica's absence was keenly felt in more ways than one. A few patients who has been on the receiving end of her harsh demeanor commented on how much more peaceful the ward felt. But not everyone saw the suspension as a good thing. A handful of Jessica's close friends on the staff believed she had been treated unfairly and whispered about how the system was out to get her. Meanwhile, Jessica was struggling with her own emotions. The suspension had given her time to reflect, or so Angela hoped. But instead of admitting fault, Jessica grew increasingly bitter. In her mind, she was the victim of a smear campaign. The idea of returning to the hospital felt impossible, but so did the idea of letting it go. Months passed, and the hospital's investigation into Jessica's behavior culminated into a formal employment tribunal. Jessica, who had spent her suspension fuming and preparing her defense, arrived at the tribunal ready to fight. She was accompanied by a lawyer who seemed just as determined to prove her innocence. The tribunal room was sterile and intimidating, with a panel of executives, a legal representative, and an HR officer seated at the front. Angela sat to one side, her face calm but resolute. Amara was not required to attend, but her testimony had already been submitted in writing. Jessica's lawyer began with an aggressive opening statement, claiming that the suspension was based on hearsay and that Jessica's only fault was being too dedicated to patient care. Jessica nodded along. Her expression was one of righteous indignation. But the hospital's case was solid. Angela presented a thorough timeline of events, supported by patient testimonies, staff statement, and evidence of Jessica's unprofessional behavior. The anonymous letter, traced back to Jessica's computer, was the nail in the coffin. When it was Jessica's turn to speak, she doubled down on her innocence. "I was only trying to ensure the best care for our patients," she said. "If that makes me a bad nurse, then so be it, but I won't apologize for doing my job." The tribunal panel listened carefully, their expressions neutral. When the time came for their decision, the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence, the lead panelist began. "We find that Nurse Jessica Marshall's behavior was unprofessional, divisive, and damaging to the hospital's culture. We uphold the decision to terminate her employment, effective immediately." Jessica's face turned pale. For a moment, it looked as though she might argue, but instead, she simply stood and left the room, her bitterness evident in every step. Jessica's dismissal sent shock waves through the hospital yet again. For those who had supported her, it was a sobering reminder of the consequences of unchecked behavior. For others, like Amara, it was a closing of a painful chapter. The hospital continued its efforts to create a more inclusive and respectful environment. Mandatory training sessions, open forum for staff to share concerns, and a renewed focus on teamwork became the new normal. As for Jessica, her bitterness lingered. She struggled to find work at another hospital, her reputation following her wherever she went. But rather than reflecting on her actions, she clung to the belief that she had been wronged. Amara, meanwhile, continued to thrive. Patients like Mrs. Patel became her biggest champions, often sending new referrals her way and returning to the hospital just to thank her. One day, she received a handwritten note from Mr. Howard that read, "Keep being the light in this place. You've shown us all what true strength looks like." In the end, the story of Jessica and Amara became a cautionary tale at St. Mary's, a reminder that kindness, respect, integrity are not just virtues, but necessities in the high-stakes world of healthcare. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.